Most of the money problems we talk about with Bitcoin, they're not actually money problems, they're time problems. Time, as we've been forced to accept it, is not neutral. It is a forward-only moving thing that moves in the direction of consumption. Bitcoin as a clock is potentially our only defense mechanism against this sort of relentless onslaught of acceleration.
What is real? How do you define real?
You can't jump into cash. Cash is trash. What do? You get out.
Scott Dedels is the CEO of Block Rewards, a Bitcoin payroll company built to hyper-Bitcoinize how people get paid. He's also the author of The Tao of Bitcoin and the author of The Age of Time, a journey through consciousness, reality, and the end of the modern illusion. About mechanical time, the clock as Western civilization's invisible operating system, and Bitcoin as the technology that completes a 600-year-old project the Prague alchemists were reaching for when civilization built the Orloj instead. This is the third time on the show and the first conversation we've had about this book. Scott, welcome back to the Bitcoin Matrix, where critical thinkers meet. How are you?
Yeah, thanks, Edric. It's very cool to be back here. I know 3 appearances is a big deal, so I'm thrilled. I always enjoy our riffs, and I'm stoked to get into it.
Well, this book is a big deal. It was even hard for me to get through the intro because that's how the book is. Like, there's a lot packed in here. And it's well written, and I thought very insightful into the modern age. I mean, you called it the Age of Time. I think this doesn't refer to maybe the current age. It's sort of like a 600-year sort of, I felt like, sort of timeline here we explore in the Age of Time, and not sort of the modern era on its own. But there was a lot I never really kind of came across before, and lots of layers to this. I mean, what inspired you to write this book?
Thanks. Yeah, I partly, I feel like, and this is no, disrespect to the many great books in the space. I love reading Bitcoin books, and I know you do too. And I got to a point where I started to just feel like I wanted to make an attempt to write a book that was a little bit different. And there's a lot of overlap in the different ideas that find themselves in Bitcoin books. And I almost feel like we kind of got to a place where there's just a lot of similarity in a lot of the great Bitcoin books. And I wanted to take a stab at something that felt really fresh and write a book that didn't have anything to do with hard money and 21 million and, the evolution of money. And really kind of explore some of the more philosophic and esoteric ideas about Bitcoin that really stimulated my Bitcoin journey in the first place. And one of those that I kind of credit more than once in the book was Gigi's Bitcoin is Time. I think that, Bitcoin as a transformational civilization level technology, these are really cool ideas. But most of the discourse around Bitcoin is tied to money, and if you want to narrow it down even further, is really about price. It's just the way it works, right? And so I think that the time angle is something that is just really a fascinating topic. And the more I researched, so I wanted to write this book about Bitcoin and time, and I started reading a lot of books about time to prep myself. And that book really took shape and took a completely different direction than the one that I thought it was going to take. I'm interested in architecture, and I think we've talked about architecture and some of the other conversations. I learned a lot about what people think time is and how we got here. And that was really a surprise for me and a really cool inspiration for how the narrative kind of took shape. It's this idea that, like, civilizations run on a theory of time, and we think that ours is sort of the objective and final version of it because we were born into it. But I think that it's possible that it's really not any different than models of the universe, or different ideas that we think are final and then can end up being replaced by something else. And that's really where this notion of Bitcoin as a clock, I wanted to try and do something with it that took it a little bit further than where I've seen it discussed elsewhere. And what does hyper Bitcoinization look like in a non-monetary use case like timekeeping?
Yeah, well, I think you nailed it. I almost think there's, space. This book didn't have to even address Bitcoin. Bitcoin's kind of tied in because Bitcoin is a time machine. It's a time chain. Or a truth machine. And there is sort of an angle here that's very applicable and insightful and sort of looking at the future. But the book stands on its own up until the Bitcoin era. Like, what is time? Why is the clock so important in our life? And how does it sort of drive it? And sort of, for me, it was sort of looking back at the whole industrial age. So maybe we could start with the Jiang lantern. The lantern is, this is your moniker. So this is sort of maybe timelines and multiverses just in that alone. But what is the Jiang lantern?
Yeah, Lijiang. It's a city in China. I lived in China teaching English like 20 years ago when I was first finished university, and had so many cool experiences over there. Lantern Festival is something that happens. Lijiang is an ancient city, and for people, this is a whole other thing about China, and for people who haven't been, there's lots of like China in social media right now, China maxing, and it's so different than what people might imagine, and the kinds of progress that's happening over there. And I think a lot of it has to do with the kinds of propaganda that we're exposed to that we don't actually understand or realize is propaganda here. But China has, among other things, like really incredible historic sites because they weren't bombed heavily like Europe was in World War II. Inner China never really ransacked. And so Lijiang is deep in West China, sort of at the steps of the Himalayas. And the town is thousands of years old. It was a Silk Road. It was a Silk Road town. And so, yeah, I had this experience while I was there at the Lantern Festival, and this big download around lanterns being a technology of information transmission. Lanterns were a solution to like the scaling problem of light and transporting fire. And a lantern is this sort of ancient technology that was invented to transport, the flame, which is symbolic of, the spark of human ingenuity and so many other things. But it was something that I wanted to weave into the book because the book really is very much also about the information transmission that happens, the chain that happens that creates civilization. And, Bitcoin is another one of these things that, I say in the book that civilization itself can be thought of as a giant coordination problem. And, this is getting into, the Bitcoin white paper and the computer science problems that led to the creation of Bitcoin, solving coordination problems. And so we have been solving coordination problems since we invented fire. And so the lantern to me felt like a very appropriate starting place as like an early link in the chain. And so that's where that came from. That's why I wanted to start there.
Yeah, and there's a lot to break off from there in terms of sort of chains and more about the lantern. But let's maybe start with the birth of linear time. I don't know if we should start with the legend of Han. What is it? Hanu, or or sort of the Prague Orloj.
Yeah, so I thought, this is another one. Prague is a really cool place to start the story of the book because of the Bitcoin conference that happens in Prague. And it just so happens that Prague is a sort of like Bitcoin significant city in the world. And it also has this incredible clock that many, people who go to the Bitcoin conference make sure to get their photograph with. Yeah, I mean, I thought it was a really appropriate place to start the story in Prague because of the Bitcoin conference that happens there. And ironically, like, people go to Prague for the conference and get their photos taken with this iconic clock. The Orloj is this multifaceted, it's a multi-faced astronomical clock that, in addition to telling minutes and hours, also tracks the motion of the sun and the moon and the constellations. So it's expressing a lot of different information. It's just a really beautiful artifact, like really iconic moment in the history of timekeeping. And it's a really fascinating thing to think about how the introduction of mechanical timekeeping technology, and the Orloj is one of the initial ones, started to shape the reality of Western civilization. So Prague wasn't the first. Italian city-states started introducing town center clocks. And what happened is that people's behavior started to adapt to this central mechanism of timekeeping. So it's, it became a piece of infrastructure and bureaucracy. And this was a shift that started, like you said, around 600 or 700 years ago, where the introduction of a new type of timekeeping technology changed behavior. Somewhere along the line, and I wonder how this evolved, but we stopped thinking about it as being something artificial. And we just started thinking about time as being an unquestioned aspect of reality. Like, they're all entirely made up concepts: minutes, seconds, hours, like the length of them, the number of how many are in a day. That this is just something that we agreed on. But there's nothing in nature that observes hours. And weeks are the same thing, right? Like, weeks are a much older idea. It goes back, thousands of years. But each individual day is identical, as far as like the natural world is considered. But we created the idea that they cycle in a rotation of 7. And that has to do with like a lot of different sort of cultural and religious concepts that evolved over time. But I guess the idea is like, civilization is sort of a lattice of agreements that end up as unquestioned beliefs, and I think that's very true today. And it's maybe only when like an idea that gives us a frame of reference to question whether or not that makes sense is when ideas become up for debate again. Like, and this is kind of what happened with Bitcoin and money, where, maybe the gold bugs were questioning fiat money before. But, now I would say in the 2020s, fiat money is all of a sudden like a term that's part of the cultural lexicon, whether people are interested in Bitcoin or not. And so I'm interested in how that idea evolved and how we got here to today. And the Orloj has been like left behind as this marker of that transition, because there was a time before clocks. And the people who would have lived through that transition would have experienced like a really radical evolution in the collective idea about how civilization worked. Like before clocks, the idea of like pegging certain things to certain times would have seemed crazy and totally foreign.
Well, that's what, yeah, this idea of what would be foreign. I wasn't aware of sort of even the belief that I have that I'm not questioning. So I never thought about life before time. Never thought about how maybe time might. I mean, I thought about how like sort of how we perceive time is artificial, maybe in the units we use. But I always thought about time as sort of being there. And I never really thought about what life was like before, not just time, but known time and sort of coordinated time.
Yeah. I mean, and so the ancient Greeks, like Plato was writing about time, and they had different words to express different kinds of time. So there was time that referred to like the motion of the heavens, celestial processes, and then there was a different word for time in the way that it is experienced by people. And this is another funny thing that's happened over the course of 2,000 years. Like in the English language, we have reduced that concept down to one word, time. And it's an all-encompassing descriptor of all of these things, because intellectually we've arrived at this unquestioned assumption that time is a thing, like it's a aspect of reality or a part of the physical universe. And then this is like another thing that the more you read about time, like it's a very difficult thing for people, physicists or mathematicians, to prove that there is such a thing.
Well, let's talk about sort of maybe the world before mechanical time, but kind of maybe indirectly. What is the tyranny of the clock? Sort of, I never really thought about how coordinated time or, sort of time being some sort of having a feature of authority.
Yeah. So this is another reason why I want to write this book, back to the very start of the conversation. And like, I think that we spend, if you're going to be in Bitcoin, you're going to talk a lot about what happened in 1971 and 1913. And, the focus of the problems of money and fix the money, fix the world, these are all things that you find in Bitcoin books. And I think that the problem of time is actually, upstream, is a more significant than the problem of money, and that the problem of money is a subsequent problem, and that we are focused on it because it's easier to identify with. It's more obvious. Like the time problem is a lot more abstract and probably feels less urgent. But I actually think that most of the money problems, even that we talk about a lot with Bitcoin, or feel if we're thinking about, like modernity, or, the nature of like life in the anxious, attention deprived society of today, they're not actually money problems. They're time problems. And it relates to this. The Tyranny of the Clock was an essay written by a Canadian anarchist named George Woodcock in 1944. This was actually the thing that really got me started down this time rabbit hole. And Woodcock sort of makes the argument that after the invention of the mechanical clock, specifically the pendulum in 1657, the ability to standardize units of time allowed us to, for the first time, turn time into a commodity, which Woodcock argued became the chief ingredient of the Industrial Revolution. And it was the segmentation of time that allowed for things like industrial shift work, time zones, trains, scheduling, and time, when it becomes unquestioned, a dominant form of timekeeping, forces everyone to conform to it. Like you can't have 99% of the world running on hours and minutes and some other country trying to run trains when they're using a different measurement. Like it doesn't work, right? So time became this like this just our standard form of timekeeping now became the dominant form of thinking about time in a very short period, and forced everything to or arrange itself around that global logistics. And today, you know, like global logistics are just a critical part of how society functions. So we end up becoming slaves to the clock because we created it initially to be a tool for coordination and efficiency. And what happened in the end is all of us are, you know, our lives are run by time and timing. You're late for meetings, your calendar is full, you're constantly looking at the clock on your phone. Like how many times during a day do we need to know what time it is? When there would have been, you know, like actually most of human history where that idea would be just totally foreign, and wouldn't even understand what you were talking about if you tried to explain it to them.
Well, yeah, there's a lot there, especially around like coordination. I never thought about how much or the aspect of how that gives some entity power. And then how the coordination is not just, you know, for scheduling, but across a time zone. So I'm on the East Coast. It's an 8 o'clock game here. On the West Coast, it's 5 o'clock there. We're experiencing it at the same time, but we're not during the same time of our day. Yet then even like things with daylight savings times, it's like arbitrary. Well, now it's an hour later. And how I never really thought about what life was like comparing that to life pre the clock. And we're still at sort of the town square clock, and sort of how that drives factory life and trains and sort of commoditized, like how, you know, scheduling, like I think there's a lot of benefits. Like my accounting brain is like, well, you know, now I know how I can book all the employees, manage shifts at the factory, you know, but I didn't think about, you know, a lot of sort of these small things about like, if you don't show up on time, you're going to be locked out of the gates. Yeah, just things like this. Yeah. And sort of the cost, like you were saying, of looking at your clock, so the cost or drag on your attention when you're doing a task that you're trying to get deep focus on.
Yeah, so I think like mechanical time was a scaling solution to coordination beyond a single physical location. So we were doing amazing things before clocks, like building pyramids, but that, you know, that was restricted to a shared area, you know, where everybody was coordinating under the same space. And it just kind of happened that, you know, the clock then arrived when travel started to speed up. You know, trains were a really good example of like safety. Like we actually needed a way to coordinate and standardize time, because, and this is another like Bitcoin thing, right? But like, what do clocks really do? They help us agree on the order that things happened and will happen, which is one of the core functions and problems that Satoshi solved when he was engineering Bitcoin. And so if you think about clocks as helping us do that, you know, nothing in this book is an argument that they don't have like a positive benefit. It's more to say that the way of thinking that accompanied that innovation produced a sort of mania that is responsible for driving a culture sort of like obsessed with endless forward progress and consumption, and that ultimately prepped us for the arrival of other control mechanisms like fiat money.
Okay, yeah, we'll have to. How does it lead to fiat money? Sort of. the clock or sort of the coordination of time?
Yeah. So standardization and segmentation of time allowed us to think of time as something that could be bought and sold and accumulated and traded. And there were interest-bearing loans before the mechanical clock, but they were a lot simpler. So we started to see the introduction of more complicated time-related financial instruments after the introduction of timekeeping. And it was Ben Franklin who coined time as money, like 100 years later. So when we started to be able to think about time as a commodity, we started to be able to think about pricing time. And, and this is where I think that we start to see the first central bank, I think it was in Sweden, was like 30 years after the invention of the clock. So, central banks are coordination mechanisms, scaling solutions too. So, this was an idea that Larry Lepard shared with me, is thinking of sort of the post, Renaissance or Enlightenment Western civilization as being a journey towards progressive centralization, as a number of different sort of coordination problems were solved, and central banking being one of those things. So they were all like really important and meaningful innovations for their time. But what's just also true is that the end point of that, or that those systems all, centralize, like right now, we're basically at like peak centralization as big tech conglomerates itself into like 6 or 7 companies, and government has never been bigger. So maybe this is sort of reaching its endpoint, or playing out to its conclusion, and it's a process that I think actually started with mechanical clocks being the first innovation in that family of centralized scaling solutions.
Yeah, I wonder when we get to the point where there's like 6 or 7 companies and they do everything, and there's more countries than companies.
Or I mean, like, we might see fewer and fewer countries too. And,
I think that. Yeah, I get. Yeah, agreed. But it'd be interesting if there were less companies than countries at some point. What about Saturn? How do we go from Saturn and to the Watchmaker god?
So I was also interested in, like, there's the physics of time, and there's sort of the theology or the philosophy of time, and they're sort of separate but complementary subjects. And Saturn is a fascinating subject that goes back a long ways, back to Plato or even older. There's in early astronomy, they were studying the 7 wandering stars, which are so the planets and the sun and the moon, the 5 visible planets and the sun and the moon, because those are the bodies, celestial bodies that don't behave the way the rest of them do. And the outermost visible planet to the naked eye is Saturn. And so the early Greeks and Romans had ideas about Saturn being associated with boundaries and limits. And there's a great myth of Kronos, was the Greek name, consuming his children out of fear of the future. So Saturn was always associated with time. And that idea changed as Christianity became the dominant religion in Europe, and there was no longer room for like a pantheon of multiple gods. And Saturn, the Saturn of ancient Greece and Rome, turned into Father Time in medieval Europe. And the Watchmaker god was sort of the last version of this concept. And is the idea that in the Enlightenment, Enlightenment thinkers were trying to imagine a world where God existed, but everything made sense. And the Watchmaker God idea sort of like came out of some of these, Newton and Descartes, and the idea that if the perfection of the universe fits together like a clock, then God must be a watchmaker. He must value precision and order. And this thing is a giant system and mechanism where everything functions sort of beautifully and perfectly together. And so the watchmaker God is sort of a culmination of different ideas that evolved over centuries and really elevated the concept of timekeeping to like divinity. And this is where I think part of how we got to where we are now, where nobody is thinking about whether or not our system of how we think about time makes sense. And it's because this concept has just been drilled so deep into the collective psyche and our cultural consciousness that it's not up for debate.
I want to dig more into the watchmaker God. I thought a lot about sort of when you talked about how the watch ended up on the personal body, the wristwatch, the pocket watch, started carrying time around, how this sort of, what impact did you sort of grow up with, like, don't be late, be on time. And also, what am I doing with my time?
Yeah. So that stuff goes all the way back to ancient Greece, and the idea that like time, Saturn, it's this force that only consumes. Like life only moves in the direction of loss. And I don't know what your parents. My dad was always preaching to me to be, if you're on time, you're late. We're always trying to be punctual. Time is something you need to spend your time wisely. So the watch itself would have been another really weird thing if you think about, like, we went from not having clocks at all to everyone sort of paying attention to the same clock in a town center, to then all of a sudden people having access to time for the first time, personal time, the time that they were wearing on their body. And that became a piece of high fashion. It was a way to virtue signal. Like, that was where the early ideas around punctuality being like something to be praised for came from. And the pocket watch was like a real status symbol, like the gentleman's dress. And I mean, it still is, right? Like, watches, high-end watches are massive status symbols today. And like, it is kind of an interesting thing. Like, among other things, it's an obedience to the concept of the clock. And we do, like, I'm sure everybody's like this. You feel the unconscious urge to glance at your phone to check on what time it is. And like, why do we do that? Why, how does that change what you were doing before you felt that urge? It's just a really funny thing that we do, and we do it all the time. And it's a result of a lifetime of conditioning and generations of conditioning. Like, this is the thing. I think it's like, this is an interesting thing to look at, of like how we got to this place where it's such a fundamental aspect of our life, when for so much of human history it would not have been a thing at all.
Yeah. I want to unpack on the urge to check the phone, but first we got to talk a little bit more about Saturn. Saturn, how does Saturn show up in the week, and what did Saturn do with his kids?
Yeah. So Saturday, like the days are still, the days were all named for the planets, and at some point, Monday through Friday were renamed for Norse gods that still conform to the planets. But those days now, the origins of those names come from Norse mythology. But Saturn is the name, the inspiration for Saturday. and Saturday is the boundary of the week. And that's what I was saying earlier about this idea that, like, we made up this idea that a week is 7 days, and that has to do with the fact that there are 7 wandering stars, and it's just another idea that we made up. But so Saturn became the idea that was associated with all the different boundaries, and so we still actually are worshiping Saturn in a way when we can't wait for Saturday. Right? Saturday is our day of rest. And, it goes back to these very early ideas that were actually very literally about celebrating Saturn. The Romans had a Saturnalia, Saturn festivals. So, these things have some origins that get lost and buried over centuries, but that's where that came from. And so the Saturn mythology of the Saturn consuming his children is another piece of that. Like, this is it's part of that sort of elaborate tapestry of the conception of time as a devouring force and something that needs to be feared and respected. And all of these ideas are, like, still really present. Like, this is why today you have that urge to look at your phone for no reason. It's because, the conditioning has gone back longer than we can comprehend.
Wait, didn't Saturn devour his kids?
Yeah.
Just sort of like destroy all chance of the future?
Yes. Yeah.
What do you take from that?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the more sort of famous stories, I guess, from Greek mythology, and it's this idea that, like, time consumes, time devours.
Can you expand on that? Like, it's so fascinating, the sort of this concept of, like, thinking about how to use your time.
Yeah. I mean, so like, going back to this idea of the pocket watch, and even back to Woodcock and the tyranny of the clock, is we are okay with the time system we operate in because we don't think of it as oppressive. This is sort of my general theory about it. So nobody's upset about time in the way that they might be about fiat money, because in the fiat money, it's really easy to realize that you're being stolen from, and whatever. We don't have to rehash all these kind of, like, other kind of money ideas, but the idea of time itself was invented at some point and imposed on all of us, like, a uniformity of whether or not is accepted. Time is not up for debate. And 2, along with that comes this feeling that there's a discipline of time. And that's what this, like, consuming the children really is time, as we've been forced to accept it, is not neutral. It is a forward only moving thing that moves in the direction of consumption. And so that's what I really think the sort of the core, like, underlying problem with civilization adopting this unquestioned form of thinking about time really is that it hasn't been, it's not a neutral idea. It's an idea that has, these concepts of constraint that really do go all the way back to the early ideas of Saturn, and Saturn as a boundary keeper.
What is then Saturn the operating system?
Yeah, so I think that we have this installed in us, and it's like we were talking about when your parents are teaching you how to be on time for stuff. We get taught how to read a clock when we're really young. Maybe before you can read, you can tell the time. And so this is the kind of initiatory programming that happens, and we do it to each other, right? Like the system perpetuates because like it's unquestioned nature. We go around and we then install it in each other. We install it in our kids. The system polices itself because everyone has to run on the same time, right? We live in this like clockwork civilization. So it's learned, like a baby has no concept of hours, and this is something that's taught to them. And the subsequent, like the connotation, the context around what that means for you as a person participating in society is also taught. And, so that's what the Saturn operating system is. It is a logic system that operates in the background, and the de facto way of thinking about the world is that it runs on clock time, and that clock time itself is a type of discipline that is best self-administered.
But it also like you explain this in the book, and I want to get into how it like drives modern anxiety.
Yeah. And this is kind of what I was saying earlier about how like it's easier to point out the problems that we think are money problems, because if your money is becoming less valuable, then you probably have less time. You have less, like the anxiety, you may then associate the anxiety with the money. But I actually think that most people would be less worried about money if they weren't worried at all about time. Because like genuinely, I think what most people would do if they had unlimited money would just have full autonomy over their time. Like most of the things people would do with wealth actually relate to time. And having the ability to enjoy yourself and be with your loved ones and like pursue your interests and passions, like those are time problems. It's having the time, and maybe the financial resources, depending on what you're after. But like, I think actually most people are quite happy without fabulous riches. But where they start to really squirm is when they don't have any time, which itself is a crazy idea, because even that we think about it in this Saturn operating system way. Like you would think about how many or how few hours you have, whereas like, people before this way of thinking was really integrated, again, it just wouldn't have been a thing. You lived in time, like life just happened. It wasn't segmented or partitioned in this kind of like very rigid way.
Quick one. You know the thing that happens. A bill shows up, taxes, a repair, some life thing, and the cash isn't there, but the Bitcoin is. And there's this little voice, just sell a little. You've got enough. Every Bitcoiner knows how that movie ends. You sell, the thing rips 2 weeks later, and that little sliver you let go turns out to be the most expensive cup of coffee of your life. That's the exact moment Firefish was built for. You borrow against your Bitcoin instead of selling it. And the part that matters to me, it's non-custodial. Your coins sit in a multi-sig the whole time. You're not handing them to anybody and hoping, which is the thing that blew up in 2022. Don't sell your Bitcoin. Live off it. 30% off your first loan at firefish.io/ref equals matrix, code matrix. This episode is brought to you by Club Orange. If you've ever wanted to meet the people behind the orange-pilled accounts you follow, Club Orange is your map. It's the easiest way to meet Bitcoiners, find Bitcoin events, and find merchants accepting Bitcoin in your town. The whole network lives on your phone, and it's built around where you actually are. Download Club Orange today in the App Store or Google Play, and head to cluborange.org/matrix-podcast to get started. Your seed phrase is the most consequential sentence you'll ever own. And writing it on paper is the weakest place to put it. Stampseed is a titanium DIY kit that lets you hammer those words into solid metal. Fire resistant, waterproof, crush proof. 20 years from now, that piece of metal will still be there. Stampseed.com. Code MATRIX gets you 15% off. Yeah, there's sort of like, there's many ways to experience time. A lot of this book gets into sort of how we, just as a society and a civilization, experience time differently since the clock. One of the ways I think about that is sort of, I used to work, away from home. I'd have to fly out every Friday, Monday morning or Sunday night, come back Friday. And when I came back Friday, I think, I got 38 hours at home. I have time. But, now I'm like sort of clocking the time, counting the time. And I'm thinking to myself, and I'm counting for it. Well, 19 of that, I hope it's sleep. Probably going to eat, do errands for 6 of those hours, and you start thinking about, and how much time is that going to leave me for social endeavors, to see my friends and family. And then you start thinking about how people then maybe infringe on your time. Like you're like, I got 3 hours to see you and you showed up an hour late. But then there are these moments where, crisis like 9/11 and there's like, seems to be no time. And then there's like vacation time where it seems like there's all the time. And I mean that when you're in maybe a deep book or something where you're losing sort of track of time. Sometimes on vacation, you're always looking at your watch, but sometimes you have days and it just, like maybe you've had, I think maybe experiences like that. But it's just, I really kind of explored a lot how, the sort of the urge to look at the phone even is sort of exponential of the clock. It's the alerts and how that takes you out of your own time or thinking about time.
Yeah, I think it's a byproduct of this mentality of progressive optimization. So we were talking about this, before we started recording, this idea that life was simpler when money worked better. Objectively, things are speeding up. Like technology is making us have an expectation of things being more instant. And then that instant nature of things drives a quickening, like it makes things have to be even faster. And I think that it's noticeably accelerating, so like if I think about the 80s or the 90s, how I remember it, it's the pace of change was just so much slower. And that process goes actually, I think, well back beyond any of us being alive. It's just that we observe processes from our own vantage point, right? Like it's a moving train and we all get on the train at some point, but we only have the ability to really observe the train trip from the stop that we got on it at. The train's going faster and faster, and everybody can see that. It's, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I do sort of remember sort of the 90s where, you'd get home maybe early from something and you're like, oh, I have 5 hours before I'm going to go to sleep. I'll stay up all night. And that means I have 5 hours to do, like, it's like this blank slate. And you didn't have email, you didn't have alerts, you didn't have breaking news. And you didn't have friends you could call, like, all around the world in different time zones. There was literally nothing to plug into. Those stores were open. There was no 24/7 shopping, 24/7 content, no new movie coming out at 2 a.m. And you could read a book or write a book or listen to a new album or just like, I don't know, organize your closet and not feel like there was anything else to be done.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of, it's interesting how you talk about how sort of Saturn devours the future in that way with the children and stuff.
And that's this weird thing that like Saturn like so many corporate logos today are Saturn inspired, and we see, and this other aspect of the symbology of Saturn is the cube, and the cube is another symbol that repeats itself throughout our built environment and in our art and logos. And I sort of think about this as like, the Saturn logos too. It's almost like it's like an interference that happens when we're all running this software, this Saturn software, and we express in ways that make sense based on the fact that we're all thinking in this certain way. And I think that way is unnatural. Like this is a learned behavior that we've all been forced to integrate, and the result of that is, like I said, this sort of like mentality of progressive optimization, which results in us repetitively building boxes and straight roads. And so over time, like the physical environment is a mirror, like it reflects this acceleration of the mentality of progressive optimization.
Yeah, you sort of described how sort of maybe time cities have these nooks and these crannies and this sort of experience of just turning corners and you don't know what's going to be, like almost choose your own adventure. And modern cities have this grid-like formation where it's like there's nowhere to go, but you don't stand here. You just keep moving.
Yeah.
And then sort of all that pushes towards commerce and the commodification of human endeavor and time.
And it's like that, the great scene in The Matrix. If there are people who are old enough to remember when The Matrix came out and nobody had seen it yet. And this was also, again, like pre-early internet where movies didn't get spoiled. And you actually went to a movie early on because you didn't know anything about it. And like the ad campaigns for that film really didn't tell you a lot about what the story was really about. And, the first 20 or 30 minutes, Neo's like a regular guy living in the regular world. And Morpheus has to tell him what the Matrix is. And, it's a metaphor for this system that we have like collectively erected and do live inside, and it is invisible to us because we like this is the nature of the Matrix itself, that it's designed to sort of sink into the background.
What about sort of how time affects beauty and sort of civilizational memory and the cathedral?
Yeah. I love ancient buildings. I love looking at the history of beautiful buildings and cathedrals across Europe, the state capitol buildings across the US. We were thinking about buildings a lot differently, and the transition of time, of how we think about time and how we think about money, I think can be observed in buildings, as a breadcrumb. The buildings, like they stay on as a window into how a civilization was conceptualizing time. And this is where I think like Bitcoiners, do love talking about time preference, and building beautiful buildings is, one, it's a great act of like low time preference. But we do just think about buildings differently today, and it's easy to see looking at the kinds of buildings we build compared to those beautiful ancient buildings. Like the contrast is obvious. So, cathedrals in Europe could have easily taken several hundred years. And like, that's just the first, most simple thing. We don't build things that take several hundred years today because, in part, like, the money works so poorly that it would be impossible to forecast the production cost for a building that would even take 30 years. So we would never, you would be insane. But like, if Elon said tomorrow, like, we're gonna build a building that we hope to have finished in 2400, the Tesla stock would probably tank. And it's because we don't think that way anymore. And so these buildings, how is that a window into the collective idea about time? It's, if you imagine a civilization that is committed to building something that's going to take 300 years, built into that is the assumption that 300 years from now, the builders will still be there. And so it is like a reflection of sort of ingrained beliefs about stability, about cultural stewardship, about doing awesome stuff for future generations, and this stopped at some point. Like, when you go to the, London or Paris, it was really the 19th century was the end. There's a very distinct style of buildings that was common in America too, and Europe, sort of granite and limestone and copper domes and columns. And these buildings are like the highest quality, and many of the state capitol buildings are these buildings, right? Like, look at the Iowa State Capitol building. It's like the most incredible building you've ever seen, and marble everywhere, and every detail is beautiful. And that is a type of, attention to detail and commitment to excellence. It's like the epitome of low time preference. And today, like, I love pointing out the progressive degradation of fast food restaurants. And if you look at like what McDonald's used to look like in the 90s, they had like characters and slides, and like they would have been colorful and like really interesting exteriors, and they're all just boxes now. Like, the only difference between a Wendy's and a McDonald's is the color of the box. And that's actually in a very short period. Like, that's in 30 years. And so to me, this is again the idea of like, it's not just something that changed. It's an awesome like barometer for the pace of change. So we are, to me, measurably right now in this like period of cultural erasure and accelerating uglification of society. Like, I actually think that uglification of society is a really understudied and powerful tool of social control. Because the other thing I think that happens when you go and visit those places, like if you've walked Rome, you can just imagine like the immense sense of pride that comes from living somewhere where these incredible monuments to civilization are just laying around everywhere. Like, there's beautiful human achievements of architecture and labor. And we are products of our environment. So if we, when people, it's like with kids, like if they don't have to take care of their stuff, they don't take care of their stuff. And so any idea can propagate and, like take hold. And so I think that, earlier cultures that predated mechanical clocks or, were earlier on in that cycle left behind for us, beautiful buildings to look at, but like we should be looking at them really thinking like something changed more than just technology, like something fundamental about what we value in terms of how we organize ourselves and what kind of civilization do we want to be in? It's almost like we've got to this place where civilization, we are just bystanders. We don't have a say in how any of this like really works. And it's not, it's an overly simplification because there are people building beautiful buildings, but yeah, it's a statement about sort of like a civilization level perspective shift that I think is the result of the adoption of a technology.
Well, the beautiful buildings really do, for me, sort of beg questions. They're anomalies in some ways. So the Iowa one, I don't want to be an obnoxious New Yorker, but there's sort of, I look at things, I sort of say, oh, that makes sense. Noted. Things that don't make sense, I say weird or interesting. There's these spectacular buildings, say the Capitol in Iowa. When it was built, I'm thinking the world's best builders were not in Iowa. The locals of Iowa, while they might have wanted something to be a monument to their time, probably didn't have the skills. They were probably focused on other, I would think, industries that are non-related. And it'd just be hard to imagine they were able to sort of contribute enough wealth at the time. And so then you think, okay, who did build it? Like, if they weren't local, because this wasn't New York or Chicago or even San Francisco or burgeoning LA. And so do people commute or work, like leave home to build this beautiful building thousands of miles away? And they should be the people, we should know their names now because they'd be the richest people on earth if, like, to take that job. It's just an interesting thing to me. And some of these buildings, because you also mentioned sort of the age of fires. And sort of, there's weird wrinkles there. I mean, I grew up in New York and Queens. There's these relics of the World's Fair. And there aren't many cities that have the relics left over.
Yeah, I mean, every city's had a great fire, like all of them. And this one journey for me started in Seattle. It's like, this is the closest great fire city that I had been to. And you kind of learn about the Great Fire of Chicago. Even as a Canadian kid, like it's a popular piece of folklore.
I don't remember learning a lot about that as a kid, to be honest.
Oh, interesting.
Any of the fires, and I'm from New York, but I remember learning about the World's Fairs, and I have a great aunt who's very old. I don't know, but like she was there for the World's Fair, and I think someone I know was either maybe my parents had maybe a wedding at one of the relics or building near there. So
it's a wild rabbit hole, man. Like some of them, I mean, St. Louis and Omaha, I think are two. There's great photos of the World's Fair from Chicago, and so that one gets a lot of attention. And I think that there are lots of photos of St. Louis. There was a lot of beautiful buildings, and they would have required a lot of expert stonemasons and materials. Like it's
I think about sort of the cost alone. I sort of run how we think about costs now, and just the incredible endeavor and not the extraction of wealth, but the contribution of wealth to these things at a time when not a lot of other things appeared to be very modern or as wealth thought out and constructed.
I mean, I talk about this a little bit. This is another Bitcoin thing. I mean, like, there's a problem with history, and this goes back to the idea of the lantern. The unbroken chain of information transmission. There are problems with history being wrong and changed, and it's because we don't keep history on an immutable ledger. History is another thing that's been centralized, and like the Smithsonian is one of these sort of centralization caretakers of the historical narrative. And they could be definitely editing things out of history. As an example, we don't know. But this is another thing that I think that Bitcoin potentially changes as we, are able to share the idea of a distributed system that is immutable, and what that means potentially for some form of record keeping, forward only, but again for generations that will come long after we're gone.
I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you didn't. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot we can get into Bitcoin. I really want to stick to the time thing, though.
Yeah, totally.
Bitcoin is a time thing, but I want to talk about sort of how time is not what we think, how that affects cognitive bandwidth, sort of the brain as a time machine, consciousness as a delayed composite. I mean, there's just so much here, especially in chapter 6. And the way you sort of outline the book is sort of the clock. So I guess it's 6 o'clock in the book. The body is oscillator, strange loops, these sorts of things.
Tons there. Yeah. So one of my favorite books of all time is this book called Gödel Escher Bach, which was an inspiration. It's Douglas Hofstadter wrote that book, and I read it 25 years ago for the first time, and fantasized about writing a book to emulate it, or to pay some homage to it. And Gödel Escher Bach is a book that compares music and art and math in patterns, and introduces this concept of strange loops. And it's a system that he describes as the human mind forms meaning through self-referencing thought. So it's something that I had been thinking about for a really long time, and I thought it would be cool to be able to introduce it into this discussion of Bitcoin and time. And then I ended up reading a book called The User Illusion by this Danish guy, Torno Tranders. And User Illusion is an information theory book that has to do with the idea that the brain, we think of our experience of reality as though it's very real. It's reality happening in real time, and so what our eyes are just windows directly into our brain. We see exactly what we're seeing. We hear exactly what we're hearing. But the simplest idea in the user illusion is the problem that sensory information arrives to the brain at different speeds. So a visual stimulation is the fastest. It's the quickest route to your brain, and touch would take longer. So it's a very small delay, but the brain doesn't just experience reality. The brain is a machine that aggregates different sensory information and dubs it into a coherent thing, and that's what our brain experiences. And so the user illusion is that we think what we're experiencing is direct reality, when what we're actually experiencing is something that's been buffered and edited. And so that very much relates to time, because that process actually takes a little bit of time. It's a fractions of a second. But this conversation right now is happening for us on a slight delay. So our perception of time, our base level perception of time, is off, because we don't actually, what we think of as real time, as the moment itself, we don't actually experience it in the way that we think we do. So
go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, please, you.
So it's a wild thing to think about, like, that earlier idea of like, well, what is time and why did the Greeks have different words for it? Is time something that's happening? Is time a fundamental force of the universe? And how does that reconcile with the fact that if I'm anxious or bored or scared, 60 seconds can be experienced in a completely different way? Like you said this earlier, but it's just true that while we can tell everyone 1 minute is 60 seconds and every 1 minute is identical, that's not the truth of the human perception. The internal perception of time changes a lot. It has a lot to do with your internal circumstances. And it affects how we create memory and how we remember time, in a lot of different ways. So I think that, the idea of like, I wanted to sort of trace this progression of what is observable in the external world and then take a stab at the systems and processes that happen in individual minds that cause those outward expressions. So, civilization is a collection of minds, right? It's just like a lot of different people coordinating together to solve problems. And so we would all be running this software. We are all thinking in similar ways. We're sharing agreements. And that's what makes these coordination problems solvable. That's what scales civilization. But it first starts in the mind, right? Like every building, every road, every invention, all of reality is first a thought. Like everything starts in our minds. And so, yeah, this idea that even at the base level, our experience of time isn't what we generally think it is a pretty wild idea to noodle on.
Well, I mean, you've had experiences. I'd like to hear more. You went to a dinner party, and you experienced it very different than you, I guess, could see it later on through the use of an element that could kind of alter how you even perceive time and your ability to go back in time.
Yeah. Yeah. So I tell the story in the book. I had an experience with a plant medicine called iboga, and ibogaine is kind of like actually hitting mainstream right now. There was a Rogan episode about it recently, because I think that it's I think it's Kentucky. The state of Kentucky just greenlit a large scale, sort of publicly funded investigation into like the different medical properties of the plant. It's a wild psychedelic journey that really dislocates your individual perception of time. And part of what happens in that journey is like an encyclopedic access to memories. So you're almost like outside of time for hours. And yeah, I had revisited different moments in my life, and one of them was this dinner party. And it's a crazy thing that when you experience this thing, you have like almost like a high definition, ultra high definition access to memories in a way. Like, if I was recalling this podcast 10 years from now, I would remember what your shirt looks like. Like I would remember the writing on your shirt. And so you realize in that state that we are taking in hundreds of times more information than our conscious minds will allow us to process. Like, it's all filtered out, I think, so that we can have like a sane and digestible experience, like living our normal day-to-day lives. But we are observing like everything, and all the senses, and your brain is constantly taking in all of this data. And then we just reduce it down to sort of the minimum requirements that we need to operate our bodies without injuring ourselves, keep ourselves fed, navigate our physical environment. Like we really are. Experiencing reality through a series of like survival mechanisms. And that's what the user illusion is. It's like we've learned all these different ways to just exist, and those things have become like so like automatic that we don't even consider them as being something that is sits like 1 degree above reality. Like this is all just part of being a human to us, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely the exploration of sort of, I think time is coming up more now in terms of people are looking at like sort of timelines and multiverses, and also just these psychedelic experiences where I think these things can, help you break paradigms in your mind, explore maybe rooms you didn't feel like you have the key to before, maybe have mental sovereignty, or sort of raise your frequency. But it's interesting how so there's sort of like what it can do for you going forward, but it's also how you can analyze maybe things going back and maybe pull on these threads or yarns that you didn't realize you had all this information at your disposal. And those could be sort of, maybe difficult in terms of you thought you looked great in a moment, and then you pull more information in and you realize that you were just maybe protecting yourself by excluding certain information that your brain absorbed but didn't sort of process and, or deliver to the part that's functioning or consciousness. And that really protecting yourself was maybe even harming yourself or harming others by not dealing with the actual reality, and you got your own version of it. And then there are these moments with people where you just remember things differently. And I've started to think like, maybe they remember it differently because for them it happened differently. And I'm trying to reckon with that, maybe because it's just like you have these where you feel like a black and white, you did X, and they're like, I did not do X.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, in my world you did. And then like, and it's just, and they're like, are you calling me a liar? And maybe I'm trying to imagine these versions where they're on this timeline where they didn't do that.
Yeah.
Or they didn't say it or whatever, you know what I mean? And they have a different version of it, or maybe they did it, but they didn't on my time, like it's crossing timelines, that's what I'm saying. But it's interesting, just the way we experience time. But it, so the clock is sort of this external force, and it can kind of become authority, but it's not necessarily truth. And this is what you explore in the book, right? Because time, clocks can drift, I guess, and there could be dislocation and sort of differences in opinion on time. It's kind of like how Bitcoin is no close. It's 24/7. Like, when is close?
Yeah.
If you want to make a bet, Yeah.
Yeah. So and this is where I sort of think like, Bitcoiners are maybe well positioned to take on this idea that you just said, that like the clock isn't necessarily truth, because it is sort of the same mind pattern to think about fiat money and Bitcoin as it is to think about like mechanical time in Bitcoin. It's just maybe one further step down the rabbit hole, if that's the right way to, like categorize it, or, but, and this is kind of why to get back to like Neo in the Matrix, it's like this realization that the Matrix isn't any one thing. It's everything, it's all of the different pieces that fit together to create an unquestioned reality. And so money is one of those things. But it's not the only thing, like this is where the fix the money might fix some things, but the money is just one part. It's just one part of the system.
So let's talk about the clock outside of the cube. I mean, how does Bitcoin sort of impose or become sort of a different form of external time?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think like one, the idea of defining a clock as a thing that we use to scale the agreement around when things happen. And that is really what we do with Bitcoin, right? Like we predominantly use that to prevent double spending and have an internet money that works without counterfeiting. But like what we're doing is we've invented something as a species that enables agreement around the order that things happen without any one party being in control of the central timekeeping. And if you accept that mechanical timekeeping was introduced and became the dominant form of agreeing around the order of when things happened, then I think you kind of have to accept that it's possible for us to change our mind about what the dominant form of timekeeping is. And so this is kind of where I wonder and where I go with the timekeeping thing is, as a civilization, as a species, what is more important and like what is a better mousetrap for producing a place that people want to enjoy and thrive and live? Is it like the relentless forward motion of the circle that just repeats itself endlessly, really without self-reference? Or, is it the chain where every link in the chain references the link that came before it? So I think that Bitcoin, as theoretically, as a dominant form of timekeeping, has a possibility to actually install a different shared way of thinking about the meaning and value of time. And the buildings, again, are useful because the built environment changed as our shared understanding and agreement about what the dominant form of timekeeping was. So if it were true that could change again, and we were to change it in favor of a shared way of thinking about time that promoted collectivism and long-term thinking, then I think it's reasonable to expect that the civilization that would emerge out of that shared way of thinking would be better. It would be, it would prioritize things that are, solve bigger problems than the problem of money.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I'm going to read a piece from the book, sort of about the cathedral in cyberspace. The people who laid the first stones of Chartres or Notre Dame did not expect to see the completed structure. They worked inside a horizon that exceeded their lifespan. The vaults would rise under different hands, and the stained glass would be installed by descendants. A cathedral is an intergenerational memory system in stone, a structure that only makes sense if those who come after you matter. To build something you will never see finished is a declaration of temporal love, the willingness to act as an ancestor. Deep time thinking begins modestly, first by extending planning beyond the immediate crisis, then beyond the quarterly cycle, then beyond the arc of a single career. Eventually, it crosses the boundary of personal lifespan. You stop asking what will benefit you and begin asking what will endure. In that moment, you are no longer standing at the front of time. You are standing inside a lineage. Viewing yourself as an ancestor reorganizes identity. You are not merely the inheritor of past decisions. You are a contributor to future conditions. Civilization, seen clearly, is accumulated meaning transmuted through generations. Every ritual, law, craft, and monument is memory made durable enough to survive its makers. Bitcoin belongs in this lineage. It is an intergenerational project in cyberspace. The chain began before most of its current participants arrived, and it will continue after they are gone. Decisions made now will be evaluated by nodes run by descendants we will never meet. The system anticipates them. Each block is not only a ledger entry, it is a contribution to a structure that outlives its contributors. Each act of validation is a small act of stewardship. Meaning compounds because continuity cannot be casually erased. When you begin thinking as an ancestor, the horizon shifts permanently. You are no longer racing to stay ahead of time. You are participating in a chain of contributors whose membership spans centuries. You are neither the beginning nor the end. You are a link. This sort of like just talks about sort of the individual and I think the civilizational experience with the clock and how it's sort of taken us out of the past and out of the present and sort of out of the future and sort of making the present sort of never ending and like overloaded and almost never experienced, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is kind of what that like notification culture and like urgency society, the accelerationism forces us progressively inward. Like when you have less time, it's like a survival mechanism. You're going to think more about your own personal immediate needs. And that drives short-term thinking, right? Like that drives high time preference decisions. And when a lot of us or most of us are forced into urgent high time preference choices, the world around us starts to reflect the collective decision making process, which is like very much where we are now. Like this idea that we don't have the time to think of ourselves as ancestors. We think of ourselves as standing at the front of time, where cultures that decided to build something for 300 years had to anticipate the people who would finish the job. And this is something very fundamental that has shifted for the worse. And where I think that Bitcoin has the opportunity to reintroduce this kind of ancestor style thinking into civilization by first priming individual people to start thinking about 4-year cycles, or start thinking about the idea that, if I buy this $30,000 car today, that car will have cost me $1 million in 8 years. And so we can start to see reality first shift in individual people. And as more people embody that way of thinking and making choices, it creates a ripple effect then and becomes a stepping stone. And this is where, I think that we spend so much time agonizing over Bitcoin like right now, and it's perfectly sensible. Like we can't see the future, but there is an ancestor way of thinking about Bitcoin in that it is a technology that has been designed to outlive us, and it's the only monetary system that has been designed to inspire optimism about the future. Right? Like if you have to basically be pro future if you want to be in Bitcoin, right? Because you're imagining that it's going to exist, right? And this is, the more you think about that, the more you realize we don't necessarily think about this way, but a lot of the urgent and high time preference decisions that we make now are the result of some kind of subconscious understanding that we don't necessarily believe that our money will be here or be here in the way it is here today, tomorrow. And this actually does go back to Saturn consuming the future, because we live in this system where time consumes. And this is kind of like where Bitcoin is a super elegant solution to the problem of time, because it gives us a way to think about storing time. Bitcoin's as a tool for measuring value, because Bitcoin doesn't degrade, we can convert our own personal time into sort of a time battery that can pass value forward through time. And that mechanism, I think, is what allows people to start extending their decision-making horizon and start thinking more, stretching out their time frame for decision for important personal decisions. So the saver believes in tomorrow, right? And humanity operating under a system where everybody has that opportunity, I think naturally starts to look a lot different. If all of a sudden everybody, and you got to remember that, like, outside of the Western world, the average life of a currency is 22 years. So like 100 years, 110 years is like an eternity for most of the world. Like, most of the world's population actually lives in that currency reality. And their physical world definitely reflects it. Like, you go to the places where the money's really failed, and that's where you see all the shanty towns, and the infrastructure is like really, we could do a lot better. So these are the things that I think start to get changed as we rewire. It's a time problem, right? It's thinking about the future differently. It's thinking about the here and now differently.
Brought to you by Club Orange. We talk a lot on this show about the circular economy, Bitcoin moving peer-to-peer, staying out of the fiat system. Club Orange is how you plug into that in real life. It's the easiest way to meet Bitcoiners, find Bitcoin events, and find the merchants accepting Bitcoin right in your town. Less doom scrolling the timeline, more shaking hands with the people actually building this thing where you live. It's on iOS and Android. Download Club Orange today in the App Store or Google Play. Stampseed is the most analog object in your Bitcoin stack. No batteries, no firmware, no third-party trust. Just a titanium DIY kit that lets you hammer your seed words into solid metal. Fire-resistant, waterproof, crush-proof. The simplest, dumbest, most reliable backup for the most important cents you'll ever own. Stampseed.com, code MATRIX for 15% off. I set up my own Firefish account, and I'll tell you exactly why. I've spent years on this show telling people don't sell. Low time preference, hold the line. And then you live long enough, and life hands you a reason. A down payment, a business, a kid. And you're sitting there staring at your stack thinking, am I about to break my own rule? Firefish was the first thing I found that let me keep it. You put up your Bitcoin as collateral. You get the liquidity you need, and you never give up custody. Your keys stay in multisig. Nobody's relending your coins behind your back. You don't have to choose between living your life and keeping your stack. And that's the whole point. Don't sell your Bitcoin. Live off it. First loans 30% off your fees. Firefish.io/ref equals matrix. Code matrix. Links in the show notes. Yeah, well, I think about it as the clock being like sort of fiat in the sense that it's a never-ending attack on your time and your present state of mind, and taking you out of, let's like the way you kind of like deep time.
Mm-hmm.
And without deep time, the individual person and humanity or civilization can't really accomplish much. Like, you've expressed it, or we talked about just like beauty is like the anomaly of these beautiful buildings, but none of our buildings are beautiful anymore. Nothing is built to last. That's the expression of our society, or the expression, or that's the lack of expression. But the expression is, the Target megastore, the Walmart, things that won't last. You sell things that don't last in a building that won't last. And then every moment is sort of, your son or daughter wants you to go play in the park, and you have to ask, do I have time for this? And then there's this sort of, you really go in, and it's, or your friend, or it doesn't have to be a child, it could be, but sort of this, the moment you wake up, there are 10 people not in the room who've sent you email across space and time, demanding your time and you're now sort of figuring out your day and how you're already behind, reacting to someone in a different time zone on a different time scale, all of it. And then you have to sort of coordinate truth around what happened at 5 o'clock on Thursday, April 30th, well, more like June 30th at the end of the quarter. What did you see? What do we see? And none of it's really about what's actually happening. It's and how Bitcoin, I think, from a not a number go up perspective, but because it has this time chain and this way of just slowing sort of like the heartbeat of the world down, or the individual's world down, and then collectively maybe. That's sort of, but I want to ask you then, how does AI then jump in here?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good, it's a great segue, because I think that AI, it's sort of like my idea of what the singularity is, or what we think of as the singularity is the destination of like the end state of this mechanical timekeeping acceleration, like to the point where it just actually can't accelerate any further. So the thing about the human mind that we sort of skipped over when we were talking about the user illusion is like meaning takes time to form. Like the human mind needs time to like comprehend an idea, to digest it and internalize it and make sense of it. And if you want to share that idea, the more the broader you want to spread it, the more time is required. I think this is another thing, like why 2% of the world understands Bitcoin after 17 years is like, we're trying to teach 8 billion people something. It's going to take a while. So while that's going on, the time that we have to form meaning is there's an assault on it happening. And this is what speed is really doing. Like when ChatGPT, when AI can create content faster than a human can read it, we're not only being asked to live in this notification world that just feels like it's getting faster and faster, but we're actually now being asked to form meaning, I think, beyond the physical limitations of the human brain. Like we just actually can't keep up with the pace. This is where AI is going, and it already is there, honestly. Like if you're using Claude Fable now, like it's absolutely bananas the kinds of output this thing can do at the speed it can, and the expectation that a human person could keep pace with it is totally insane. And that is going to continue to speed up. And so I think that Bitcoin as a clock is potentially like our only defense mechanism against this sort of relentless onslaught of acceleration, because technology will only be limited in its speed by, hardware, how fast information can pass. And we see things like this with like Polymarket and like sports gambling, and like, you used to bet on the game, and now you bet on like, how many points in a quarter a player is going to get. Is it the under, and it's like instantaneous. Everything is moving more towards like colliding with the present moment. And that force is what narrows our range of perception, shorter and shorter to that high time preference decision making. And so what Bitcoin does is it forces us to agree that nothing can be final in less than around 10 minutes. So it sort of establishes a hard floor around our expectation of forming meaning, which it's not just a good thing. Like, I think this is a critical guardrail, because we don't have an ability to build systems that keep us safe. So Bitcoin is this thing that can create a time boundary for us. And because no one controls it, that's just a really vital contribution to the mental health. Like, imagine what this problem is going to be like in 2040 when AI is incomprehensibly powerful. And, like, we're just going to be expected to be further and further merged with the information hyperstream, right? So I think that the 10-minute heartbeat, offers like a different path. It creates a different kind of agreement to say, like, and we see aspects of this like everywhere, right? Where if you've gone an hour and you haven't responded to a text message, the person who sent it to you is wondering either you're dead or you're pissed off at them. Like, we have really started to internalize the expectation of instantaneity into every aspect of how we live. All right, this is how this clockwork mentality arrives at this endpoint. Like, it's all so subtle on its own. And so it really is the possibility of us moving to a different agreement around time and what's important in time. And it couldn't come at a more opportune moment, because I think that, where this goes with AI over the next 3-5 years is it's going to be brain melting. Like, there's just going to be no way for us to keep pace over the long haul. So we shouldn't even try. We need to build systems that are going to allow us to have a human experience in a human world. And, so the technology serves us instead of us, becoming slaves to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've all had that experience around time where, I don't want to throw anyone on the bus, but like a loved one will be like, you're meeting them for dinner at 6:00 and they call you up at 6:04 and they're like, am I in the wrong place? And it's like, one, I don't know if you're in the wrong place, but are you now indicating to me that I'm late? And if we're talking about 4 minutes here and you're now, and if you are in the wrong, like, I don't know how to figure out if you're in the wrong place, because if you are, then I wouldn't know that. What do you see? But it's this conundrum around time. And time doesn't really linger anymore. I also think about this sort of these prediction markets. It's like the edge of present time, or the edge of time, where these prediction markets or sort of create reality. If enough people predict it, it's like, well, sort of the metaverse, or not the metaverse, the communal consciousness that absorbs that energy. Then the system then puts out that energy and tells everyone the odds. Everyone then reads the odds and says that's so going to happen, and then piles in even more.
Yeah.
And then we get into this place where there's no real sort of free will, maybe.
Yeah. Totally. I mean, and then you get into like, Minority Report, and like, it's
you voted for X, so we know you'd want to do it.
Yeah, totally. It's like AI is a prediction machine, right? Like, the LLMs work based on guessing the next word. It's just insanely sophisticated, right? But that's really what's happening. And those systems, as they get better, are designed to predict better. So that is what's going to happen, right? Like, this, AI is going to get better at guessing what's going to happen, while we are getting more involved in believing that guess is right.
Right, but what's really difficult is all the information's in the cloud, and you don't know how often the cloud's been rewritten.
Yeah.
And then no one has collective or individual and or collective or like sort of historical memory. And so no one really has the sort of perspective for informed decisions or challenging the predictions or the AI information.
Yeah.
What is dataism?
Dataism?
Yeah, what is it? What Harari, the
Oh yeah. I tried my best not to not to let my feelings about Harari be too obvious in that, but I wanted to mention him. There are some very like anti-human ideas being passed around by world leaders in Davos and the World Economic Forum, and some of Harari's ideas fall into that category for sure. It's this idea that basically we're moving to a place where human decision making, human thought, these are just things that won't make sense anymore or won't have any value. I think that there's a possibility of technology creating a dark future. This honestly really why I wanted to write the book, because I think that part of the issue with the overlap about Bitcoin books that I was talking about at the start of the conversation is, and I've observed this in my own life, like not everyone is interested in economics and the history of money and rhinestones. And that's actually, I think, a limiting factor for a different segment of people being introduced into Bitcoin ideas. And, you start talking about art and culture and freedom of expression and choice. And I think it's a much broader audience. Like there's a lot of people who have weird hangups about money and ideas about money. And for that reason, would never look at Bitcoin or never think about reading a Bitcoin book. And that's actually another reason why, like, the book doesn't really reference Bitcoin. It wouldn't appear to be a Bitcoin book until you read it. Because I want people who aren't interested in Bitcoin ideas to read it and, see if they resonate with these time ideas. It's the same way, like when I started my Bitcoin journey, I wasn't learning about Bitcoin either. I read Price of Tomorrow by Jeff Booth. And that book also doesn't talk about Bitcoin in the description. If you go to Amazon and look at how it's explained, there is no mention of Bitcoin. It's an idea about technology and deflation and all these other things. But there's truth in the idea. I think that book was so successful because it tapped into something a lot broader. Yeah.
He didn't bring up Bitcoin until like the last page.
Yeah.
Like,
and
really.
I tried to do something very similar. Like that was intentional.
Can you tell me about the tattoo?
Yeah.
Can you share that story?
Yeah. So I do think that, so this is in the book. It's not just that we experience time on a tape delay. It's possible that our experience of linear time, as time moving only forward, is a function of the physical limitations of the human body, like, and how the brain works. So that we organize time into a linear narrative, and that's another process that's happening in the brain that we mistake for reality. And if that's true, like, this is where some of these ideas about nonlinear time and multiverse or things, you see in film and fiction now, this idea is called block universe. And it's the idea that actually time is not, independent of individual people. Time is not linear, that everything, the universe is a state of organization. And everything that has ever happened or will ever happen is actually occurring simultaneously. And that our mind, as part of making sense of time, actually works like a blockchain, where we put things in order. So things happen before other things. And this is how our time sense functions. So we're not able to remember things that happen in the future because it's like a block is unconfirmed until it's confirmed, and then it's just a part of the blockchain. And so there are blocks that for our blockchain are unconfirmed, but those events might not have not happened in the way that we think that they, like, the future is uncertain. So there's an idea that, intuition is some form of tapping into, like remembering your future and to remembering things that haven't passed yet. So I tell a story in the book. I got this tattoo when I was 29. It was like a really impulsive decision. It's a giant like pinup girl. I got it on my arm, and like super out of character for me. And for years after, like I had really thought about like why did I do that? I have other tattoos, but like this one is quite a bit different than the rest of them. And it was like a kind of a statement. And like 7 years later, I ran into I met a woman that I ended up in a relationship with. And she's like, as much as anybody can look like a cartoon, like we both remarked like basically immediately that it looked like I'd had this woman tattooed on my arm. And we sort of had joked at the time that it was like a symbol that it was an obvious sign that we were meant to date. The long story short of it is that relationship kind of ended catastrophically. And I think of it now as, this kind of intuition was some kind of like a warning sign. And I love movies, and I talk about movies a lot in the book. And Interstellar is a movie about time. And in Interstellar, he in the future ends up in this, time. He's outside of time, and he's influencing things that happened in his own past. So he's sort of his own guardian angel. And it's a very literal representation of the idea. But I think in a much more like, often like art, entertainment is based on things that are real, but just less entertaining. So if it's possible that, we might actually know everything that happens to us in our whole lives. We just don't have the ability to access that information as cleanly as we can interact with memories that things have already happened in the past. So intuition could very well be simply your own ability to reach forward and touch memories that haven't confirmed in the blockchain yet.
Yeah, this story was so fascinating to me. It had a different ending than I anticipated starting the story. Like you think, oh, they're going to get married.
Yeah.
He's got a tattoo of her on his arm. Then I'm thinking, okay, now I have so many questions. Like one, like how come if you know everything in the future, your future intuition didn't like prevent you from getting the tattoo? Or how come, or maybe you remember dating this person and having a catastrophic ending, but maybe you have the tattoo and now you have to explain to someone else that you dated someone else that had a catastrophic ending, but maybe that didn't actually happen and you're misremembering the whole experience. You know what I mean? Could that happen? And then you think about, is there a timeline where you didn't date? Is there a timeline where you didn't get the tattoo? And if those things are happening simultaneously, can you just choose your own memory chain from different timelines? Like what? Because especially like if someone else is like, that didn't happen the way, your memory chain is not maybe immutable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, definitely. It's, and I've seen different like articles suggesting studies that like it's possible that changing memory can slightly, change the past, or, it certainly can change our recollection of the past. I think, at a higher level, I try to really like, and I'm not an expert in any of these subjects. I read a handful of books. I'm interested. And, hopefully like our readers would agree. Like I try hard to avoid, making definitive claims. Cause we really don't know. And I certainly don't. But more than more than that, I think it's about, presenting ideas and hopefully having some interesting discussions.
Yeah. I think we'll, sort of where I kind of want to take this now is just sort of maybe to hash out a little bit. Because I think like Bitcoin, it does, I think, affect your frequency, we call your spirit, your soul, sort of how your pulse, your vibe. I don't know how to describe it. And it's not about number go up. It's about certainty in the future. Part of that certainty is the hypothesis that you're buying something that can't be debased. It is scarce. It's provably scarce. So it's sort of, there is that aspect of it. It's undeniable. But I think as soon as you get those first sats, you start thinking about time and your own future differently. And I think this book really starts to go at that. Sort of, it's not your typical Bitcoin book because but where Bitcoin is sort of this external force, similar to how the clock was this external force. The difference is, just like every other oracle, the clock is sort of this artificial authority. And Bitcoin is not an artificial authority, in my opinion. It's sort of it's math. It's sort of pi. It's 21 million exists in the universe now. That's sort of the cathedral within, and the time chain, I think, is a cathedral. And I think, we can riff on this, but we're seeing it now. How do we treat the time chain? What is the culture of the time chain? What is our responsibility as a steward for this thing that outlives us? But what I really want to get to more than maybe the technical side of that, or, is really maybe the great returning. If you've referred to it, the long human, sort of long civilization, and what sort of, because I think that expands on how Bitcoin affects maybe the soul or our being beyond number go up.
Yeah. So I guess, personally, like, I'm bothered by the direction of all of these things. And this is another reason why I want to write the book. And, again, this idea that we adopted mechanical timekeeping as a framework for shared reality acknowledges that there was a framework that like pre-existed that concept. And, like the ancient Greeks, Romans, they were also building and living very differently. We, like Graham Hancock, and like we marvel at early human cultures building sites and structures that were observing this. It's called the precession of the ages. It's a 26,000 year cycle. That's how long it takes for the constellations to move roughly back to their original position. And this has always fascinated me because people would have to be watching the stars for like hundreds of years and relaying that information to even come up with the hypothesis that what was happening was a returning, like a cyclic procedure where the constellations rotate. And, like you would probably have to get maybe half, I don't know, a quarter of the way around before you'd be really firm in the like assertion that like now you're ready to start building monuments that align to this process. So 6,000 years, 12,000 years, like we're talking about, the modern mechanical clockwork world is like 600 years at the most. So 10 times that number is the time consciousness that human beings would have had to inhabit before they would start building, like Mayan ruins, Mayan pyramids that were observing these star processes. So that's how people were thinking together before. They were thinking in terms of 26,000 year processes. And so that's actually how far we've compressed it to where now we watch TikToks for like 7 seconds. Like that is the actual scale of the problem that we're talking about. And we're not actually at the end of it. Like the acceleration can continue. So the argument about the great returning, and I fully believe this, is that the natural state of the human mind is to occupy a time consciousness that is much, much broader than the present moment, and probably broader than one individual lifespan. Like, I don't actually think that we are meant to even exist in this hyper focus of the events of our own life. To me, that's a reflection of a culture that manages time. Like, this is Saturn devouring the future. Is we've got to a place where we think about our graduation and our wedding, all of these individual milestones. Those have actually replaced, I think earlier cultures, or to participate in a culture that was building something that was observing a 26,000 year process. You're just not really going to be able to be mad about when your partner was 4 minutes late meeting you somewhere. Like, those two things are just incompatible, right? So I think that the natural state of the human mind is to occupy a very different relationship with time. And so I think that if that's right and true, then we should be able to go back there. And what's needed is a paradigm shift, like a different civilization adopts and conforms to the dominant form of timekeeping, is sort of like the central argument of the book. And so if that were to change, then civilization changes, like the human interaction with time changes, and the world we decide to build together changes.
Yeah. I mean, I might have gotten that when I read from the book earlier, a few words wrong, because when I dictate. But I think the key sentence there was, decisions made now will be evaluated by nodes run by descendants we will never meet. And a lot of times I think about, in our current society, it seems like you could either do it on time or you could do it right. And everyone just wants it done on time, and it's just living in the present. Part of what we were talking about earlier, when we used to get home in the 80s and 90s, I think, and maybe even before 2008, you'd had time to kind of contemplate what had happened. There was more of a shared source of what events had happened, more codification in news, or even just your personal life. There was just seemed like less happening, more time for contemplation. I want to read a piece from the book, because I can talk about how Bitcoin is anti-oracle. The claim of this book is not that Bitcoin alters physics. It's that for the first time since mechanical clocks centralized authority over temporal coordination, humans have access to a system that orders economic history without asking permission from a ruler. Civilization stands at a threshold. One side equals compression. Decision-making must accelerate. Judgment is replaced by procedure. The other equals an architecture that lets delay, cost, and irreversibility shape order without enforcement, where meaning is time to form and commitment carries weight, when acceleration becomes the organizing principle, when speed becomes intelligence, does judgment have anywhere left to stand? And so, I think about, the mempool and, what we put into each block sort of in our lives and all the transactions in our lives. I do wish there were maybe, there's a lot of advice about, like, never live with regret, have no doubt, just sort of like ignore the past, rewrite the past. I can't help but feel like maybe there's some transactions I wish didn't end up in my, blocks or my time chain. And whether I could go back in time or change them or throw them out or, learn from them, maybe more importantly. What do you, maybe just, I just feel like that, the book sort of gets into sort of, for the first time, humanity shares one clock. and how that sort of stabilizes civilization. I want to read one more piece. Bitcoin. Well, actually, yeah, I read that. So, what do you sort of? I'll leave it to you for sort of parting thoughts. I found this book very moving. It sort of explains, I think, a feeling that's been underriding or just sort of throughout my life. I'm trying to explain, like, why do I always feel like I don't have time? You think how do I create time? It's the weekend. I should have time. Why do I have chores? Why can't I do what I want to do? Why do I have to contemplate my masters via this calendar when I want to go play? How come I can't play more? These kinds of things. So, and to your point, I don't think that comes from money or all stems from money. Maybe this is more upstream than that.
Yeah. I hope the book is, inspirational or, optimistic and uplifting. Like I really, my writing is, I try to have that feeling. I am optimistic about the future, and, we have all adopted this form of timekeeping, and that this is like the thing about there's 170 different currencies all over the world, but like there's 24 hours a day, no matter where you go. And so timekeeping has really been more successful in terms of its dominance as the adoption of a technology. And I think we're going to see a lot of change. Part of this thing about AI and the belief creating the likelihood of an outcome, I see a lot of, kind of like the AI doomerism. There's maybe like an underlying feeling of inevitability of, Skynet or whatever, where this could go. And, it's about the critical mass of like the collective agreement, and I think that we can manifest a different reality. And this is actually why I think Bitcoin is so important, and why I think it's critical to start recruiting people into Bitcoin that aren't interested in money. It is a bit of a race. I think that looking at it right now, it seems like AI, has more inertia than Bitcoin. And, I think that there's a version of this future where we have shifted some of these ideas, where we've hyper Bitcoinized time and created somewhere that feels a lot better. I think that that feeling you described is what I would hope is the version of that idea that was so viral about Price of Tomorrow. Is that I have this suspicion that all of us are feeling this same type of anxious experience of the present moment. And my theory is that it has to do with the fact that our natural state is existing in this like really different and expanded relationship with time. And it's something that we haven't really thought about, again, because like the time problem isn't obvious or urgent in the way the money problem is. And to me, that's why, the book is hopefully interesting and thought-provoking.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the clock is like an attack vector, And I'm not, I come out of this with a little AI doomerism. We are facing an onslaught of information, this hyperstream, I think you called it. And you talked about how there's, no matter how you cut it, it's 24 hours in a day. I don't know. They shut down CERN. And, I mean, there is this sense, I think, or this buzz that time was a little faster for the last few years.
Yeah.
I'm trying to wrap my head around that, like what that means. Is it a sense of time? Were there really only 18, 19 hours in a day? Who controls time? Well, sort of the books outlines it. It's like we went from what is time to what time is it?
Mm-hmm.
And the sort of AI and the clock, these things are sort of encapsulating people. Leads, we talked about sort of prediction and prediction of reality, but also people don't think for themselves. With I think the onslaught of AI, might think less for themselves. I feel like Bitcoin is sort of the way I see it, especially with this BIP 110 conversation, is sort of Bitcoiners, or Bitcoin is the intolerant minority. And that's going to be hard in a world where people believe in the clocks and believe what AI tells them,
mm-hmm.
and live in that self-referencing cube, that digital cube. And I do think that, Bitcoin itself has a spectrum of how effective or how bright and orange it can be. So Bitcoin is software, and Bitcoin is us, and what we make of Bitcoin and how we use Bitcoin. And I think Bitcoin's under attack. I do. So I think I have less, I think it's a non-zero chance Bitcoin separates money from state, but I don't think it's 100% written. And I think we as actors impact getting that closer to 100 or 0.
Mm-hmm.
And I think right now, like most things in the world that are not centralized, they get squashed close towards 0 over time rather than towards 100. So I kind of look at it that way. I want to be optimistic, and I kind of like at the end of the day, I'm like, oh, we'll figure it out. But like you mentioned, like 2% of the world understands Bitcoin. Oh, that makes sense. It's going to take time. Well, like I'd say how much of the world understands that fiat is terrible, that money is broken? I'd say that's like 10% or 12%, or not a very high number.
Yeah.
And it's been broken, you could argue, since 1971. That's 50 years people haven't figured out. That's just in America. And sort of the dollar's global. It's a global banking unit. And you could argue that it's been broken since 1913 or 45 with Bretton Woods, or 13, or you can argue coin clipping. And because of this civilizational memory, how come like my ancestors aren't sitting around every table like, this shit looks like coin clipping to me? Like, how come they're not angry? How come they're not intergenerationally angry? And everyone's just like, well, pick yourself up from this is your problem now. Like, and no one's like angry on the next person's behalf or passing on the anger, and
this is where I think like the unbroken chain of information transmission is like a part of Bitcoin that people really aren't thinking about enough, because it's going to be very difficult, and this is just another thing about the long human. It might be 2080, by the time we've passed enough of that forward, which doesn't unfortunately do a lot for everybody who wanted to retire in 2024 or whatever. But I mean, if we are contributing to that future, whether we get to see it or not, still pretty cool.
Yeah. Speaking of time, I had Kent Halliburton in town, and I got to spend time with him, and he brought me cacao from Peru. And I got to see Ben Justman, and we cracked this on New Year's Eve, but I had a little sip from this at Peony Lane. It's a nice way to spend your time. But also, we read The Age of Time, your book. And I recommend people, we dug into like, maybe this is sort of like, we got into like 8 or 9% of the book. There's so much here. And I just was learning on every page. Coming up, I'm talking to Paul Rogers about money, love, and Bitcoin. So I think that will continue the conversation. I'm also talking to Luke DeWolf, defending Bitcoin. I think that one will be also very timely. And I'm wearing this hat that Kent gave me. And I'm just trying to figure out how to use my time. Not that it's all free, but like there's that question: how do you use your free time? So I really appreciated this book of yours. Thank you for coming on and sharing, and some of these personal stories. I'll leave it to you for some parting words. Let people know where they can find you and the book, and more about what you guys are doing.
Yeah, thanks, Cedric. Thank you again for having me on. Thank you for reading the book. I always enjoy talking with you in particular about books, because you're so thorough about reading them, and so it's really fun. And where can people find me? The handle is, we talked about lanterns. My handle is on Twitter is Lantern Bitcoin, and the story about that is in the book. The book is on Amazon, and I also have a website. It's theageoftime.com, and if you want, there you can order an autograph copy paid in Bitcoin. So that's there. And the last one was block rewards. So yeah, you mentioned we're building tools for employers to offer Bitcoin as part of compensation, and we just launched our US customer waitlist. So we are targeting US launch later this year. And so if you are a US employer, or you work at a US employer and you want them to be interested in what we're doing, you can book a demo or join the waitlist, and we'd love to show you what we got.
Yeah, check it out. I like how you talk about how we're living through the interval of forgetting. Don't forget to check out all the links Scott just told you about. Thank you so much. It's been so dope. Look forward to the next one. Hey, that's a wrap on the latest episode of the Bitcoin Matrix. If this one added value, share it with one person who needs to hear it. That's how the Bitcoin Matrix grows. None of this happens without our sponsors, Stampseed, Firefish, and Club Orange, companies I personally use and genuinely believe in. Follow me on X at @Youngelman and the show at _Bitcoin Matrix. We're in the conversation every single day. Stay humble, keep stacking, spend your time well. It's the one thing you can't get back. And keep your head on a swivel out there. This is said. Now escape the Matrix.